And now back in Photoshop, starting with the diffuse, and if you need to, you can go back to the color because generating bumps and normals might require different outputs from the black and white. I'm just going to stick with the diffusion. I can modify this pretty easily to get what I want. And what I want to do is turn off the UV mesh layer modifier. And there are quite a few modifications we need to make overall. First of all, what I'm going to do is work on the windows, and what we need to do is just keep certain parts of the layer style. We're going to turn on the bump, and I'm going to copy the layer style and paste it onto the bump layer. We can turn off the diffusion and now open up the layer style for this. And what I want is to turn off the drop shadow and the inner shadow. We can keep the inner shadow on because I think that's going to enhance the bump. The stroke, we don't want to have too much pattern within that. So what I can do is set this to just a color, set it to normal, set the color to white, and just kind of reduce the opacity amount, or take the color and set it down to more of a mid-range, just something that's going to be higher than what we currently have within this bump, although we can still modify the existing part of the bump. The trim on the outside is going to end up being probably one of the higher points of the image. So this should be pretty good. We can turn off that outer glow as well. So we can copy this layer style and paste it onto all of the bump layers of the windows, turning off the diffusion for each of the layers as well, and then go into the door and basically do the same thing. So select the door, return on the bump, and I am going to have to copy this layer style and paste it from the diffusion because we did have a slightly modified version of the stroke. So we turn off the drop shadow, turn off the outer glow, go back to the stroke, set that to color, change the color to almost white, increase the opacity amount, and set that to normal. If there's a little bit of variation, that's okay, just as long as the main color is really there. If we need to match it to the windows more, we can adjust that bump layer, because right now the windows are going to end up being very sunken in, where the door is going to stick out more. And if that's what you want, then that's the easiest way to achieve it. But I'm going to go into the layer style again for the bump, add a color overlay of a darker color, and we could just set that to darken or multiply, and just bring the opacity in a little. I'm going to reduce the color output of the stroke, and that should be good. So now the rest of this, the walls are really, really gritty. And with the intensity it's currently at, that's going to be too much to generate the normal map. Now, if you don't have access to running normal maps, if you're using Cinema, then you do. But if you don't have the ability to generate the actual normal within Photoshop, if you're a Mac user, then you will have to use a different program. But basically, this setup to generate the normal map is going to be the same throughout the different programs that allow you to generate a normal map. So just creating this height variation. Basically what we're doing is just creating a height map to generate a normal from. And I'm going to be using the NVIDIA Normal Mapper tool, which is a filter that only runs in the 32-bit version of Photoshop and not 64-bit. Although it does work for versions, I believe any of the CS versions, at least CS2+, and that's free, available from the NVIDIA site. There's links included with the training. If you're a Mac user, there's another program you can use for that, but you can still generate these images in Photoshop, the height map, and then just use the other program to create the normal. So what we need to do is set up an overall height and difference between the layers that are peeling away. I'm going to remove some of the overlays that are darkening and creating too much of an impact. In this case, with that original exclusion layer, I'm just going to take the opacity amount and really bring it down, just for a slight bit of darkening. We don't want much out of that. And basically just looking at the individual layers and seeing what we need to keep on and off, turning off things like inner shadow, drop shadow, and then using basically a layer style color overlay to generate depth. So we can start with color close to black, and then add opacity. Using multiply will keep some of the current definition or lines within this better than just a normal mode, but still decrease the overall height of that area of the image. So removing drop shadows from some of these different layers, and just kind of going through and figuring out which parts should be higher and which ones should be lower. For the most part, these should be basically the same. So if I need to modify some of these layers and get them to be fairly similar, the main thing is we want a big separation between the smoother or the more wall-like surface, and have the brick be at a lower part of the height. And it may also be necessary to really remove a lot of the fine details, because we don't want anything going too far in. We don't want anything with too high of a contrast. If I move up to one of my primary modifying layers, and basically the main wall layer, turn off that inner shadow and the drop shadow, big difference in the look of the map, and it's already creating that nice separation. If you need to, you can turn on the inner shadow, but you would want to severely reduce its impact, just because it might create some strange looking lines depending on the bump you used or the brushes you used to cut away at it. So if there's a little bit of variation, that can really help the normal. And what we really need to do now is just kind of balance out the brick. So we have this layer right here where we can add a color overlay a little darker, or we can just sample from the areas around it and then set it to normal mode or multiply, just to have a nice consistency. It also looks like I will need to fix some seams where it looks like I did copy over. When I copied over the layer, it did snap, I believe, to the UV outline rather than the map. So we'll just have to take a look and see which layers have that seam, and I believe that's the primary wall layer. So I did notice a problem with that earlier, so I'm going to switch over to the clone stamp tool. Just hit Alt and select over on the left side and just kind of clone that over. So Alt and click to sample the area, and then just paint to remove that seam, because we don't want that showing up within the normal. Another thing I want to do to that layer is add a color overlay that's not quite white, a little lower. And this will just reduce a lot of the grit. I can darken it a little, because we don't want a huge separation. And then we also want to modify that inner shadow, reducing it so it doesn't really increase the new medium color output. I also want to make sure I'm saving a new version of this template for the normal, and make sure not to save it for the diffusion because we don't want to overwrite that file. If I need to, it looks like that area coming down the center here isn't defined enough for the brick. So I'm just going to have to adjust that layer. It looks like it might be just part of the color overlay. Or we can just increase the contrast of the map itself. So this way we can blend it a little closer, adjust the color overlay, and then Control L for the levels. And if we want those bricks more defined, we can just drag the middle slider more towards the right and take that right slider for the high range, bring that over to the left. And we're going to go ahead and start with this. This should work pretty well to begin with. If I need to fine-tune it any further, I've still got the template. Some of these larger blocks on the bottom might be too intense, but it's a good starting point. So we'll go to History and create duplicate and go ahead and flatten. Click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Control L and Auto. Actually, I'm going to cancel that, and instead of using the auto, just do it manually to bring up to the inside of the histogram. Sometimes what can happen if you use the auto is it might clip out too much of the range. Sometimes that does happen, so you may need to pay attention to it. We'll just fine-tune that a little, and let's go ahead and duplicate this over to the material, and we can call it just the bump, so that way we can take a look at it as a bump before running the normal map filter. The normal map is always going to obviously look the best, but really, if you don't have, like I was saying, access to something to generate normal maps for you, then this is going to be the best solution. Although there are quite a few normal mapping tools available for free or very inexpensive that still do exactly the same thing as the NVIDIA normal mapping filter, which is also free. So let's go into the material, and once again we can just copy the texture, go into the bump, turn that on, and paste, and then select the bump layer. And we'll go ahead and increase the intensity, and now we can see with the bump. So we've got the bump, diffusion, and the color, which can also be acceptable. You may not need to have the normal if that's looking good enough. I'm going to go over to my render options and change my anti-aliasing to best. And we can take a look, a little bit of a better render. I do think it is a little gritty, so we may need to run a surface blur, or like I was saying before, going back to the original color map and using a different setting for the black and white, or even just modifying these maps further, because at the current point it might just not really work out all that well. So going back to that duplicate, we can run the NVIDIA normal map filter. I'm going to duplicate the layer, so we have two. I also need to close Photoshop and open up the 32-bit version because I am using 64-bit at the moment. There are a lot of ways to use the NVIDIA normal map filter, working with multiple layers. Let's just take a look at a very quick way for generating a normal map. So I'm going to go to Filter, NVIDIA Tools, Normal Map Filter. If you've downloaded it, it does install automatically and will show up. Just make sure you select the 32-bit version of Photoshop, because at the moment it doesn't work 64-bit. One of the quick ways is to select the 4 sample. If you're using Cinema 4D, you do need to invert the Y, just to avoid having to hit the invert Y within Cinema. So if you are not using invert Y, you can just invert it directly in Cinema. I'm going to do it within the normal map because I have been using mostly Cinema, and some of the other applications I use basically the same setup. So we have a filter type, which is the sampling. The larger the sample, the more area pixel amount is used to generate the normal. The scale is the intensity of the normal. So if we set the scale to, let's say, 15, and let's just go with the default, which is a 4 sample. And because I'm going from a height map, I'm not worried about individual channels. I'm going to be using the max RGB. The alpha field gives you the ability to use the height information to generate an alpha or an applied transparency to the layer. So that way you can set up multiple layers for different detail levels. I'm going to select unchanged for now. Another thing you can do is get a 3D preview, and then we can rotate around, and this doesn't look great on this system right now, but we can move around the light and really get an idea of the normal. As we can see, it's very gritty. It's probably going to be too much overall, and I probably should run a surface blur, but we'll just take a look at what we currently have. So for the most part, that actually does look okay. Well, with the obvious exception that there's way too much grit. So what I can do is go to Filter, and we're going to select Blur, Surface Blur, and just have a small radius and only affect just some of that finer grit areas. We don't want to destroy all of the detail. So using a small radius and then fine-tuning the threshold to get where we need to be. If you need to create another version or do this before running the normal map filter, you can sometimes pull out a different look and preserve the intensity. So let's just run a more intense filter and take a look at this as the normal. We could also overlay this, and I'll show you some overlay techniques after we get this normal loaded in. So I just use Control A to select the entire canvas, and then Control V to paste. Now the overall height is going to look a little different. There's also a technique to basically embed the diffusion into the normal map by increasing the blue intensity for lower areas. We'll take a look at that in a sec. First of all, let's just load this in. I believe it is going to be a little too smoothed out, but we'll just look at it anyway so you can see the output, which is a slight adjustment. So I'll just rename that normal, save out that material layer, go back into Cinema, and we can copy that texture, go to normal, paste it in, and then select the normal layer, And because we did have that inverted Y, we don't need to worry about inverting it in Cinema. This normal actually doesn't look too bad. We're going to be mostly viewing this from far away, so the biggest impact is going to be the sampling of the image map. And if you have to, you might want to sample it with SAT instead of MIP, because it's going to look a lot better, but it will take longer to render, and depending on how many duplicates of the low-res object you have, you may want to turn that off. If you end up closer up, an alias mode might be worth using. We'll just go ahead and take a look at a quick render. I am going to set up the scene a little bit further, just for the purpose of taking a look at the render of this. I'm going to add in a sky object and go into the render options, turn on, add some effects, use global illumination, and then just set some of these levels to low, preview, just something that's going to generate very quickly, just enough to get some illumination. And then go over to the light and select shadow in the attribute, and we'll just use ray trace shadow. And I don't have a floor object set up, but this should give us a good idea. Now I do want to note I do have that bump map still turned on, so let's just go ahead and take a look at it with just the normal. And that doesn't look too bad. Depending on the lighting, we'll adjust the sunlight, and that also gives you a better idea of what it's going to look like and how much depth there really is by moving around the light and taking a look at the OpenGL. The illumination of the sky object is probably too intense, and so it does make it a little difficult to see some of the detail. One thing we do is just go to that color and increase that brightness to get that subtraction, increase the diffusion, and also the intensity of the map itself. And I think overall that it looks pretty good. Might want to make a few modifications to it. It is a little smooth in some areas and not quite the kind of intensity I had in mind. If we take a look, a lot of that really might just be the global illumination. It's also, of course, a low resolution texture. So let's take a look from kind of farther away. Probably a little hard for you to see. We'll go in, move a little closer, and that should definitely work. So what we can do now is move on to take a look at the roof and finish that up. And we could always come back and modify this normal, because we still have those different maps available, and we'll still be taking a look at the different layering techniques, because we can use that for the roof. So I didn't forget about the extra NVIDIA layering techniques with the alpha. We'll just be taking a look at that for the roof and creating the tiles. I did use a rather low intensity to generate the normal. So I do want to note that if you go into the normal of the material, you can increase the intensity within Cinema and get a better output in the render depending on how close you are. If you get really far away, you might have to increase the normal further in order for it to really show. But that looks like it's pretty good because of the way the shadows are set up and the lighting. It is somewhat difficult to see some of the different features, but we'll see it a little better with a better setup of the scene after we get the roof finalized and all of the maps created.